I'm Aubrey Sitterson, and this is SKALD. You're about to hear a chapter of my ongoing sword and sorcery serial. I've written it to be heard, not read, and there's no music, sound effects, or character actors. It's all me, and I do it in one single, flawless take. We pick up exactly where we left off last time, so if this is your first episode, you might want to go back and check out some of the previous ones first. But there's absolutely nothing wrong with jumping right into the deep end either. This isn't me reading you a story. This is me telling you a story. This is SKALD, Part 23. Xylun shivered as the din of combat made its way down the hill. Though it pained his broken body, he couldn't help but shake as he imagined what could possibly elicit the horrible sounds that filled his ears. The crack of wood hitting bone, the dull clang of crudely forged iron, creaking wooden wheels, fiery explosions, and through it all, tiny, tinny screams of rage and agony, underscored by roaring, riotous laughter. And then, the worst sound of all, silence. The godless monk knew it had been a mistake coming there. Cliffhome was the forbidden village, home of the unconquerable tribe, domain of a god that Xylun feared was beyond even his powers. The halfling savages were small, scarcely more than 3 feet high, but they were legion, with numbers so great that their culture had ceased to place any real value on life. To the halflings of Cliffhome, a threat wasn't measured by whether it could be conquered, but instead by how many dozens of their tribe must give their lives to defeat it. Like a small dog left to go feral, the halflings of Cliffhome made up for their diminutive stature with a ferocity belied by their slight frames. Men, women, and children, they all fought, swinging crude iron swords, whipping smooth stones through the air, and failing all else, clamping their teeth, filed into points, down upon anyone who would dare invade their sacred lands. But where else could they have gone? Xylun's shattered legs were useless. He was entirely dependent upon Maul. Ravena, the bustling metropolis that held the College of Dreams, was much too far away. Even without Xylun's added weight, Maul would have needed to stop for rest, supplies, and sustenance beyond the measly birds that the cat-beast Skog brought him. Once again, Xylun had found himself choosing the bad option in the face of worse ones. Cliffhome and the minuscule chance that Maul could earn the respect of its inhabitants. It had been a bad decision, but it had been the right one. The fact was cold comfort to Xylun, however, as the silence abated and his ears filled with a new noise. That of tiny footsteps rushing down the hill toward him. Maul had failed. He and his monstrous pet had been overrun. They had no doubt exacted a heavy toll on their attackers, but it had amounted to nothing, as the halfling savages and their stone god, the god who walks, had decimated them. Just as Xylun had feared. The godless monk knew how desperate and hopeless his situation was. The halflings would take him, drag his squirming, screaming body up the hill, and then begin slowly cutting pieces off of him, chunks of flesh to season their grotesque stews. Worst of all, they wouldn't just cannibalize him. He had read enough to know better than that. They would take pains to keep him breathing, to keep his heart beating, as their perverse, decadent culture placed a premium on living flesh. Their stone god, he blessed those who consumed it, giving them added vitality that inspired bravery, even in the face of the most dire odds. Xylun had nowhere to run. He couldn't run, but still his mind buzzed as he frantically scanned the woods, looking for somewhere, anywhere, to hide. A place to use the techniques stolen from the monastery, the ones that could slow his heartbeat to a crawl and make his breathing so shallow as to escape even a doctor's notice. But it was impossible. As Xylun tried to drag his ruined body across the forest floor, he saw the broad, hairy, filthy bare feet of the halfling horde surrounding him. Though Xylun was exceedingly slender from his time spent in exile, he was still too heavy to be carried by any less than 6 of the strongest halflings. And even then, it would have been a struggle. So instead, the halflings grabbed fistfuls of Xylun's robes and simply dragged him up the hill. They pulled him over rocks and roots, through thorns and brambles. The hindrances of the forest meant nothing to the thick, leathery skin of those wild halflings. The pain was excruciating, as every bump made the shattered bones of Xylun's gnarled legs rub together in agony. But if he dared to cry out, the halflings answered only with laughs and blows from the flat sides of their dull, crude iron swords. They dragged him up over the hill that Maul had valiantly climbed. Xylun fully expected to find the bloody, battered carcasses of the brute and his pet, but all he could see were piles of bones, burnt and charred, beyond recognition. Xylun looked up and quailed at the sight of that motionless granite homunculus, its mouth still smoking, and the godless monk's stomach twisted itself into knots as he thought upon half-remembered tales of the burnt offerings that god demanded of the faithful. They dragged him into their forbidden city. Xylun knew that it was a rare thing to lay eyes upon the densely populated burg of Cliffholm, though he also knew it was a privilege that would cost him his life. He tried to remain brave, to remind himself that life was an illusion, that the void that came after was nothing to be feared. But he failed, utterly, and his body began to shake as hot, spiteful tears welled up in his eyes. The tears slid down his sunken, quivering cheeks as the city's communal cookfires came into view. The flames raged beneath massive cauldrons attended by halflings that leered hungrily at the monk. The laughter rang out around Xylun, but even in his panicked state, he could make out something else. Gleeful screams that, though they varied in their words, all held a simple, singular meaning, a plea for their vengeful god's desires to be sated. And in response, the halfling still dragging Xylun responded simply, "He shall have his offering." Though the bulk of the halflings lived within caves carved into the cliff's face or clusters of worn tents, there were larger, more permanent structures amongst the sprawling settlement, longhouses with multiple chimneys that spewed black smoke at regular intervals. The smoke kept time with a sinister drumbeat that emanated from the largest longhouse, the one that the halflings sped toward, laughing and howling as they dragged their quarry. A hardened halfling warrior, as much a veteran as those short-lived, savage people could produce, guarded the longhouse door, wielding a sword longer than he was tall. He pointed the outsized weapon at Xylun. Who is he to look upon a god? And in response, the halflings turned the godless monk over onto his stomach, forcing his face down into the dirt before dragging him into the longhouse. It was dark, with smoke so thick that it caused Xylun, even lying prostrate upon the ground, to cough uncontrollably. With those sharp intakes of breath, he smelled charred meat, sweat, and the sickeningly sweet scent of freshly distilled, unaged liquor. For the first time since his capture, Xylun, in his petrified state, managed to choke out a few words. "Please, please, have mercy. Kill me now. Please." Almost immediately, The halflings released Xylun's robes, dropping his body to the floor. The godless monk thought his prayers answered and prepared himself for the final blow, hoping that the halflings had something besides their crude iron blades, a sword of steel sharp enough to cut through his sinewy neck in a single, merciful blow. But though he braced himself, Xylun didn't hear the rush of metal through that thick, heavy air, but instead he heard only cruel, sardonic laughter. "You were wrong, monk." Xylun looked up and saw him. He saw the one true king of men, King Maul, sitting upon a massive throne of solid rock, far too big for a halfling, too big even for Maul's massive frame. But he sat upon it nonetheless, his fire-hardened, smoke-blackened cudgel sharing space upon his lap with two wild halfling girls, offering Maul simple bowls that the savage had repurposed as goblets. The brute seized one of the bowls, then quaffed it in a single, fluid motion, forcing the pungent liquid down with a toothy grin. "You were wrong. There are gods, and you gaze upon one now. But you will find no mercy here." The home of the pharaoh was well protected. Even better, it was well hidden. A space between spaces, a place capable of stretching the length of the wilds themselves or squeezing into a single drop of morning dew. It was hidden, not by simple camouflage, but by spells, invocations of nature itself that ensured it would exist only when and where it was needed, with portals of entry that could only be coaxed open by the most experienced hands. But all of those precautions were nothing to the Feldrun. After leaving the smoldering ruins of the nameless city behind, the heaving beast had ripped through the wilderness at a frantic pace. Twisting and turning, howling in agony, the shambling monster was incapable of settling on a direction. Though it still had Maul's scent, it was unable to follow a trail that seemed to lead nowhere and everywhere all at once. As best the Feldrun could tell, Maul's presence had spanned the breadth of the wilderness. Wherever there was a tree, a bush, a patch of moss, a single blade of grass, it all had Maul's scent, as if he had coursed through the very heart of those wild places. And he had. Eventually, the war priests following the Feldrun, the ones tasked with recording its heinous acts for their queen, were left with no other option. They steeled themselves and began chanting holy words that had been repeated so often that they had been bled of all meaning. Their voices joining together, they performed the stilted wooden rituals of their order, the ones that gave them their power by denying it to others. And together, they put the Feldrun to sleep. They didn't do it for the Feldrun's sake. No, they did it for themselves. They were exhausted in body by the breakneck pace they had adopted to keep up with the monster, and exhausted in spirit by the unnatural, soul-racking sight of the destruction that oozed out from the beast in every direction. They put the Feldrun asleep so that they too might steal some rest before continuing their gruesome march through that border realm. Though Enlith's reign had not been very long, the war priests had already learned a valuable lesson. Whenever on an errand for the queen, time was always of the essence. So instead of a full night's sleep, they rested for a mere 4 hours before rousing the Feldrun from its restless slumber. The Feldrun didn't need the nourishment that the war priests took from their simple rations, and it didn't need to rest. It had eaten more than its fill in the nameless city, and its engines were powered by something far more potent than sleep. The Feldrun was fueled by loathing. During its brief respite, with its roiling mind calmed and its bone-rattling howls halted, the Feldron had been unable to act on its loathing, unable to direct it outward upon the world that had both spawned and rejected it. With no outlet for that loathing, that seething hate, the Feldron had directed it all inward, as that was its true source, tapping into a chain that had existed for as long as the Feldron had drawn breath, the loathing of the world that corrupts the self, and the loathing of the self that corrupts the world. That loathing, the thing that drove, terrorized, empowered, and tormented the Feldron. It fed upon itself, a foul lizard that devours its tail, gaining strength, growing a replacement, and repeating the cycle endlessly. The Feldron awoke rejuvenated, stronger and more hateful than it had ever been, quivering with loathing as it grumbled in a frenzied voice, repeating the words again and again. I'm sorry. I'm so very sorry. While following the Feldron, the war priests had seen horrible things, seen things that even if they lived 1,000 years would haunt them to the end of their days. But this, the wretched, pulsating mass of loathing that now crouched before them, it was beyond even their most fearsome, unspeakable nightmares. They had gone along with Enlith's plan, as if they had a choice, agreeing that the assassin Maul must be stopped at all costs. But this horror was not what they had anticipated, not what they had planned for, not what they had been warned about. The Feldron's very presence was a promise of destruction, of relentless rot, of decay so unrelenting that it might have forced them to question their allegiance to Enlith. If they had not been so sure that the suffering endured by the Feldron's prey could only be rivaled by the punishment meted out by their queen. There was little time for reflection or regret, however, because the Feldron had taken up Maul's scent and once again set about its unbearable howling. This time, the monster's roar was different. It was no longer the howl of agony that the beast had emitted while turning about in the forest. No, this was a howl of excitement, rage, lust, and anticipation. The Feldron knew exactly where the trail led, and what's more, it now knew precisely how to get there. The wretched monster let out a scream, a noise that the war priests had never heard before, one that forced them to plug up their ears as they tried and failed to tear their eyes away from the impossible sight before them. As the Feldron let out that cry of pure, unadulterated loathing, the thin veil of reality, the one that mortal eyes think to be the only truth, began to tear. The Feldron leapt at the opening, rending it with its ghastly claws, widening that simple tear into a gaping hole through which the war priests could clearly see a band of shocked, terrified faces. Their visages were broad and tan, their normally joyous expressions twisted into masks of horror as they gazed upon the impossible breach into their arbor and the impossible atrocity that gazed back at them. The Pharaoh were armed and in defensive positions, caught as they were during the irregularly scheduled training regimens that the Pharaoh people relied upon to foster their culture of perpetual readiness. But though their bows were drawn, their spears were lowered, and their swords were unsheathed, there was no preparing, there was no being ready for the unspeakable monstrosity before them. If there was an actual skirmish, if the Pharaoh even had an opportunity to attack the Feldron, the war priests weren't quick enough to see it. They rushed behind that awful beast, the one they had unleashed upon that utterly damned realm. They followed it as closely as they dared, but by the time they entered the arbor, through the crackling, ever-shifting portal the Feldron had tore open, what they found was not a battle, but a massacre. Additional Pharaoh began to pour from the woods, eager to be the one to banish the intruder, or to die valiantly in the attempt, whatever the gods thought best. But like a scythe through the fields, the Feldrin cut down the Pharaoh. Most of the attackers fell to the ground after simply laying eyes upon the intruder, heaps of gibbering mouths and contorted limbs, the after effects of seeing that which should never be seen. Though they had participated in all of the state-mandated catechisms, though they knew that the Pharaoh were dangerous abominations, absurd mockeries of true high elves, the war priests felt their stomachs churn as they gazed upon the devastation visited upon their cousins. They knew what they knew, but all their eyes could tell them was how very similar they were to the Pharaoh, who cried out in agony, fell to the ground, bled, suffered, and died in the same way any high elf would, if subjected to the unprotected gaze of the Feldrin. A battalion of hardened veterans, led by a cagey old Pharaoh, proudly displaying his bald pate, rushed into the fray. But all of their training, all of their years on the battlefield, it all came to naught as the Feldrin tore through the warriors before focusing its obscene attentions upon the group's leader, the Farron chieftain known as Foreign. Subjected to the unfiltered sound and sight of the Feldrin, Foreign's ears bled and the vessels in his eyes burst. But still, he was a warrior, and he would not die on his knees. Digging the point of his sword into the ground, he forced himself to his feet. If this otherworldly horror, this thing he did not recognize but knew to fear above all else, if this Feldrin would be his end in his very home, inside the protected, holy arbor, then Foreign would accept it, while looking the beast in its horrible, empty eyes. The Feldrin reared up in front of Foreign, planning his opponent's end in some gruesome, unknowable fashion. But before he could come crashing down upon the chieftain, a clear voice, as small as it was forceful, rang out over the stomach-churning din of combat. Halt! The war priests, shocked, turned to see where the voice came from, and were doubly shocked by what they found. A small, thin girl with severe eyes, a human girl. They gazed upon royalty, Princess Grithana, true-born sister of King Maul and proud adopted daughter of the Pharaoh. They knew none of this, however, neither who she was nor how she had come to the arbor. All they knew was that she was about to meet her end in a way that was terrible, beyond all mortal conception. The war priest winced as the tiny girl strode up to the Feldrin, positioning herself between the monster and the chieftain who had welcomed her into his tribe. Though the Feldrin had toppled an entire city, had torn through the forest at numbing speeds, and had ripped his way through the very fabric of reality to enter the arbor, this girl, this simple, thin, human girl, she gave the monster pause. For a brief moment, all was still in the arbor as the Feldrin gazed down at Grithana in awe of her boldness. But before anyone, war priest or Pharaoh, could act, the Feldrin unhinged its jaws like some abhorrent snake, stretching its mouth open, with strings of foul saliva reaching across its cavernous maw, connecting row after row after row of gnarled, irregularly shaped, but viciously sharp teeth. But though those jaws opened wide enough to swallow her whole, Grithana refused to break eye contact with the Feldrin as she clenched her tiny, bony fists by her side. The Feldrin let out a roar, but unlike a normal roar, which emerges from a beast's throat, then travels through the air to its terrified prey, this roar seemed to emanate from the very brains of those who heard it. The pharaoh who still laid merely upon the cusp of madness were pushed the rest of the way over as the war priests frantically casted protection wards of arcane origins. Though the ancient symbols kept them from blacking out, they were not strong enough to shield the war priests completely, and they dropped to their knees as the darkness swallowed up the edges of their vision. When unhindered sight returned to their glassy, tear-filled eyes, their terror was matched by another emotion: shock. For before them, in the midst of the arbor, the human girl still stood, her gaze unbroken as she stared down that unspeakable horror, the inconceivable menace, the unnatural terror of the Feldrun. The monster was as surprised as the war priests, sitting back on what passed for its haunches and breathing so heavily that Grithana's dark, braided tresses were blown back over her narrow shoulders. "Leave this place. Leave this place. You don't belong here. You don't belong anywhere." The war priests held their breath for a pregnant moment as the Feldrun gazed down upon Grithana. Then it paused, looked down, and mumbled to itself in a voice like steel upon stone. "I'm sorry. I'm so very sorry." For the first time, the Feldrun turned away from a challenge, turned away from an attacker, and once again let out a scream that tore through that permeable veil of reality. It ripped open another portal, a way out of the arbor, and away from the strange, small girl who had dared to confront it. After their time in that bizarre border realm, with its dual suns that seemed to circle one another in the sky, the war priests had found something even more curious, and in a way they could not describe, even more terrifying than the monster they ushered through that land. The girl. The severe, angry, dark-haired little girl, who with neither weapon nor armor, with nothing more than a series of stern words, had routed that which even Endless's most fearsome warriors feared above all else: the Feldrun. The war priest wished to inspect, to investigate, perhaps even to capture this remarkable girl. But in the absence of the Feldrun and its creeping lunacy, the Farron warriors had begun to regain their senses. Outnumbered, with the odds getting worse by the moment, the war priests dove through the Feldrun's shrinking portal, abandoning the arbor. But as they did, they stole a glance back at Grithana, who held them in a furious stare, her eyes burning with otherworldly flame. If you're enjoying SKALD, please leave a good review on iTunes. It's free, easy, and it helps get more eyes on the show. Plus, if you leave a good one, I'll read it on an upcoming episode. This week, though, I have some big news to share instead. SKALD is a finalist for the 2015 Parsec Awards. The Parsecs were created back in 2006 to honor podcasts in the fantasy and science fiction genres. SKALD was nominated in the Best Speculative Fiction Story, Small Cast, Short Form category a couple months back. But being selected as a finalist is incredible. I am so excited and proud for SKALD to be one of only 5 podcasts chosen for this category. Of course, while I'd love to win a Parsec, my real hope is that the nomination and finalist status will help bring more folks to the show so that we can keep growing. Speaking of which, while awards and growing numbers are great, there's one thing that I really need to be able to keep SKALD going. Filthy lucre. Money, dinero. Please, if you dig SKALD, head to patreon.com/SKALD, where you can pledge a small monthly donation to your favorite podcast. I am all over the internet. Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, they're all Aubrey Sitterson. Or head over to AubreyCitizen.com, where I have links to everything, including SKALD, links to buy the SKALD ebook for only $2.99, my comics writing work, my wrestling talk show Straight Shoot, bio, contact information, and more. For this week's recommendation, I want you to check out the Hardcore History podcast. Dan Carlin goes in depth with fascinating historical topics, using tons of sources to get at things from a ton of different angles. My favorite series he's done so far is the Mongol-focused Wrath of the Khan series. It ain't fantasy, but it's really, really close. Thanks for listening. I'll talk at you next week.